This lecture is on Persia, the Mongol and Safavid periods, from the 1200s past the 1500s. The Mongol era was centered, the capital was at Tabriz, and the Safavid, the capital was in Isfahan. So what we're looking at today is the further refinement of many of the design elements and architectural forms that have been evolving over the past decades and centuries. So here we see from Isfahan some of the more elaborate and most famous of the various monuments. These date from the 1500s into the 1600s and represent mosque complexes. So the complexes we've seen before, earlier at Isfahan, consists of a madrasa. They consist of all the parts necessary, such as the libraries, the centers of learning, the dormitories, as well as the large congregational prayer hall for the community. So you already are familiar with various elements. You see the Iwan, the large entryway, the very elaborate one, against the false front. There's nothing behind it, it's a show front. So you see in this slide one facing towards the external fountains, and you actually see one, the top of one, within the courtyard. In these examples, these Iwans are flanked by two verticals. So each one has two minarets that again can be ascended in order to call the faithful to prayer. So in a way, it is the minaret that has been embedded within the walls of the complex. We have the repetition of the light versus dark, the repetition of the color of the stone versus the color of the white painted walls that give again that push-pull visual tension. And here we're moving back towards that Central Asian shape of arch that is narrower and more pointed, unlike the horseshoe arch or the more semicircular arches of the Mediterranean regions. So just to continue previous themes, one of the principal characteristics of late Persian art is the subtlety of color and the beautiful use of half shades and playing them off of each other in order to create these very unusual combinations that are very visually interesting. So depending on the color of the natural stone, if they're using stone or if they're using brick, so various shades of these pinks or oranges or beiges, again, depending on the location, that the contrasting shade of blue or purple will constantly be different in order to create that right sense of opposites. So here we have the turquoise in the dome with this more yellow orangey shade of ceramics, but also of the natural color of the building material. And then in the Iwan itself, facing forward, we have the more deeper cobalt blues and the purples. So here we have further details. Again, it is the arabesque with the vegetal vine scrolls. We have the geometric components, and we have the script. So still, those traditions are maintained in these later examples. And there we have two of the minarets that flank the Iwan, that is right in front of that large dome. So here we're standing on the ground looking up into that Iwan. Again, it's principally a show front. There's nothing behind it. It is simply to create that spectacular emphasis upon the entry into the mosque complex or the entry from the courtyard into the large assembly hall. And again, you still have the muqarnas, which if we use the Spanish term for it, those various stalagmites hanging from the ceiling, these little scalloped forms that are suspended from the top downward and seem to be dripping down, corroding, melting from the ceiling down into our own space. So again, they create a lot of light and shadow contrast. and a lot of visual interest. So you have a lot of flatness here with the two-dimensionality of the surface of the doorways of the Iwans, and that is your three-dimensional component that gives your light and shadow play. So some areas focus on high value, low value, and color contrast. Other areas focus more on that three-dimensional high relief contrast that is activated by the natural light. So here we have entered into the inside space. And again, it is these various columns holding these very tall vaults in order to maximize the traffic flow and the number of people that can be accommodated within the structure. Again, it's a little different from what we saw in Spain. In Spain, the ceramic tile is like the ground level, the lower level, with the sgraffito relief type decoration above. Here, the lower level is relatively plain. We just see the blocks of stone, and the upper levels are completely covered with the ceramics. So here we get into one of the mihrab areas. You see a mihrab arch on the right side of the slide and the dome that is over the mihrab arch. And here it's like a reversal of the colors. What we saw on the dome was a predominantly turquoise blue with little contrasting elements of the orange. On the inside, in this case, we have the orange as the background with a turquoise blue and a little bit of that purple and dark blue as the decorative element. So a lot of this positive negative play and contrast between the ground and the decoration, foreground and background, but very subtly done. So even though these are very large spaces, you see the scale of the person standing on the ground. They're very large spaces, as we mentioned before, because the visual vocabulary, the artistic vocabulary is kept very limited. It's only like 3 colors. It's only 3 different types of design. It works well even on a very large scale. It doesn't overpower. It is subtle, but very beautiful at the same time. So I want to make the connection here between the patterns that we see on the building surfaces and the rugs, because there is a very close connection between the two media. We should not make the distinction that one is high art, public art, big production, expensive, and one is a domestic object. That if a community or a culture has a certain aesthetic, it's going to carry through from public objects all the way to private objects. So if the Persians during the Mongol and the Safavid periods are very understanding and appreciative of the subtleties of these contrasts between the shades of blue and the shades of, we'll say, pink or salmon color. In the West, we refer to the shade of pinkish orange as the fish, like a salmon fish, because of the meat of the salmon. Or here in Armenia, it is that pink trout. So it's that color. So it's the flesh of like a pink trout against the blue. So if I have it in a building, I have it in a rug. And these various designs become very localized. So Isfahan will specialize in certain color combinations and certain design patterns, certain arabesques, certain geometrics. And once that becomes synonymous with Isfahan, you'll see it in the building, you'll see it in the rug, you'll see it in the ceramic plates, you'll see it in clothing designs and so forth. And Qum will have a different sense, Kashan will have a different sense, Tabriz will have a different sense of color and design. These become specializations of different workshops. So some more examples from Isfahan, depending on the date and the artists involved. Some color schemes may become much more vivid than others. So here, rather than doing that salmon or pink trout versus the turquoise, it's more of a golden yellow contrasted with more of a purple. So again, they understand the color wheel and they're maximizing it. So you have a variety of different wall surfaces. Within the mihrab arch, you have your mukarnas, but a little larger. You have your narrow pointed arches on the side and up above. You have your geometric structures. You have like carpet patterns. And then on the ceiling, you have that interwoven sense of like a beehive design. So you have everything, but in only 3 or 4 colors. And these patterns can get infinite in their variety and their complexity. So obviously when you're dealing with a very large building, you either can have very large shapes and very broad areas of color and thick lines, or as in this example, when we're looking up at the dome, you can go the opposite. You can have very fine detail work and very small ornaments and shapes, even for large scale objects. So when you look at the dome, it looks infinitely complex and with a tremendous amount of activity, animation, and visual movement. The last one I'm showing in this part is mukarnas. So here they are suspended. Again, this is plaster work. So it's very lightweight. It's not heavy like stone. So the plaster would be put up on the underside of these arches, and then when it dries, it would be carved to get the nice edges, sharp forms, and then the ceramics and the paint would be applied over the surface. So when we start with the Mongol period in Persia, and again that's from the 1200s, 1300s, there is an evolution in terms of manuscript illumination. As we see here, because we've already looked at Buddhist art, there's going to be quite a bit that reminds you of the Asian Silk Route, Central Asia, into areas of Mongolia, China, as well as Korea. So they're influenced by the exact same cultural and trade aspects, ethnic aspects as we saw in Buddhism. So we have more, you can call it a shovel head, or maybe more of a Korean, Mongolian head, that broader, wider. The eyes are more horizontal. The eyebrows are very horizontal. The nose is straight. The lips are no wider than the nostrils. The clothing is very simplified, abstract. So there is very little mass, very little structure. The clothes are hanging as if the body is a hanger with clothes. And we'll also see a variety of Chinese elements, such as the flowing clouds or the abstract shapes of water. So many of those elements, again, represent international Asian trends. Now, the narratives for most of these images will simply be, as we mentioned before, images of role models from literature and poetry. So these are book illustrations, shall we say, that provide illustrations for what people are reading along within the text. So text, as we've seen on the surface of the buildings, is extremely important in these cultures. So therefore, these images are supplemental to the literary narrative. So they have a lot of details that follow along with the storyline. With various characters, their activities, their travels. Most of the focus is on international travel, people visiting various different cultures, the adventures that they experience as they travel across Dar al-Islam, the various worlds of Islam. Some of these are more military in focus, so it's various battles between princes, kings, empires, because obviously territorial domination and the movement of the Mongols across Asia is a predominant theme with the various victories and losses, the heroes, the champions, as well as the defeated. In all of these cases, the horizon line is very high. So a majority of the composition is the ground. That creates a very odd sense of perspective because when the horizon is low, you see figures standing on the horizon line. They're standing on the ground. But when you have a very high horizon line, the ground sky borderline is so high in your image, it looks like the people are sliding off of that surface. It looks like they're not standing on it, they are against it. They're like cut and pasted against that background. So you're losing any sense of mass, you're losing any sense of depth. There is no edge shading here. There is no three-dimensionality in terms of color transitions. It simply is a very cut and paste type of outlining of figures against a background. No integration of figures with background. We also have problems with scale. The people at the bottom should be larger than the people at the top, but you see the men on the top right and top left are actually larger than the people on the bottom. So the horses are too small. So naturalism is not important. Remember the term we used last time? Inversimilitude. There is a sense of contrast, a sense of departure, a willing departure from naturalistic elements to some extent. They know, they have a comfort level. I can represent a person, I can represent clothing, I can represent a narrative, I can represent body language and other gestures, but there's some point I do not cross, some point in terms of landscape, in terms of light and shadow, in terms of mass, in terms of naturalistic color, in terms of fabric flow, wrinkles and lines that I don't cross. So there is this balance between the abstract impulses and the naturalistic impulses. Some of the scenes are much more celestial or spiritual. So here obviously we have angels. This is only a small part of a larger composition. So we have angels in the clouds. So actually it looks very, very Chinese in terms of the cloud designs, in terms of the Christmas tree fabric flows, in terms of the facial types. Facial types, Chinese, maybe in this case it looks a little more Japanese actually, but that sense of the floating world, it's a metaphor for what we are experiencing on this planet. But a lot, as we saw in the buildings, an emphasis on color. And before we saw the pink landscape that actually was like no other we've seen, a pink ground. Here you see a beautiful contrast. In the wings, the angel on the right is green versus red, opposites on the color wheel. The angel on the left, we have orange and blue, opposites on the color wheel. And then you see the strong coloration of the people's clothing, warm colors versus cool colors. So the angel in the center of this composition, you have a red robe over a dress that is like lavender and gold. And the other one has an orange robe over a gown that is dark green with some pink underneath. Beautiful color contrast, but it's all about color and design. And it's not about three-dimensional forms in space. So again, that's what you look at when you see the rugs. It's about color combinations. It's about pattern. It's about a sense of identifiable visual elements, but abstracted to the point where they also become a sense of pattern, a sense of decoration, two-dimensional. So at the bottom we have, typical for all these cultures, the pots of plenty, these pots with plants, the pots with water. We have trees here that are very overgrown with flowers. Again, we saw that in India. We saw that whether it was Buddhism and Hinduism, the sense of plentifulness, and obviously in Islam, it is a representation of that oasis, that heavenly garden that we saw all the way back to the Mosque of Damascus during the Umayyad period. So you have narrative here, but very abstracted. So you have the arabesque in the plant-like narrative. You have the geometric in the border. We don't have script here, but we have the color, the subtlety of that salmon with that turquoise blue. Now, many of the rugs are specially oriented, meaning they're specially to be seen from one perspective. They're not the same from the foot. If you're standing at one side, do you see the same thing if you're standing at the other side? In this case, this is to be seen where the bottom is the bottom and the top is the top. You're meant to see it where you're standing at the bottom of the slide. So you're looking at this, it looks like a mihrab arch, or you may say it looks like an arch of a porch, an arch of the garden, just as we saw in Cordoba in Spain, or the Alhambra in Spain. So you could say it's a view to an outside garden or a view to a courtyard. So there is a sense of structure there to be seen from one principal perspective. Obviously, if you're standing at the other end, you see all this upside down. This concept of a principal view, a main perspective in a rug, many people say it's because these are relatively small and used as prayer rugs. So a prayer rug you would put down on the floor, and it would be oriented in one way. It would face one way. You do see it from one perspective, from one angle. So here we have another rug, also from Persia. And again, it's all about the color, the arabesque versus the geometric, the subtlety. In this case, from the bottom and from the top, it's the exact same thing. So it's symmetrical and balanced from both perspectives. So it's not a one viewpoint or one perspective visual image. So it's probably not a prayer rug because it doesn't have the directional aspect of looking towards an arch like the last case. It is much more decorative and doesn't have those narrative implications. So some rugs do, some rugs don't. That might refer to a function or it might not. So now we're going to look at some later examples of buildings from the Safavid period. So again, it's the exact same thing with the subtlety of the details. And here, this is an entry to a school. So you already know all the elements of the entryway, of the Iwan, the makarnas up above, the subtlety of color, the contrast of the blue with the natural color of the building blocks. And there we have the dome at the top. In this case, the dome has the background color of the stone, of the building material. So the background is this salmon color with the turquoise being the ornamental color. And here we see again a greater detail of that particular dome. Now again, you have to keep in mind that you don't see the dome this close in real life. You see it from standing on the ground many meters away. So it has to make this beautiful impression. I think the architect also has in mind the color of the sky. So again, he needs the warm color of that salmon to pop out from the blue color of the sky as well. Not just thinking about the blue tiles within the dome, decorating the dome, but also the blue of the sky. So here we're inside. So these are a little more sophisticated, a little more polished, finished than the ones we saw from the Mongol period. It's all the same city. That's why it all has a family resemblance. But even more elaborate, but still staying with that limited vocabulary. And here is another with a contrast of the purples and the golds. Looking into the dome, and some of these end up looking extremely elaborate because the very, very small scale of the ornamental designs. Another dome, very similar to one we've seen before, here with the golden color as the background. So at this point, if we're ever allowed to leave the house again, I would like you to visit that mosque on Mashtots, across from Pakshuka, across from City Supermarket at the beginning of Mashtots. So walk into the mosque, and now you're going to recognize every single element. You're going to know exactly what's going on in all the decorations. Obviously, it's not as elaborate as these examples. Obviously, it was commissioned by Iran, so therefore there is going to be a family resemblance, but obviously on a much more modest scale. But you'll see the courtyard. Obviously there is no minaret because they were told not to build one. But you have the courtyard, you have your columns for the shaded area, you have your little garden in the middle, and then you have your Iwan. You walk inside, you'll have your Qibla, your Mihrab arch, you'll have some Mukarnas. So now you have to go and see the mosque in Yerevan. So the last images I want to show are the more sophisticated Safavid era Persian manuscripts. Color obviously is a major element. You still have a very high horizon line, so the figures look very, very small. They have very large heads in proportion to the body. We saw that with Japan. We saw that with Korea. Sometimes you have Christmas tree garments. Again, the clothes hang on the body as if hanging on a hanger. So many of those same elements. But look at the color. You have various garments popping out. You got a blue, a green, a red, an orange, beautiful colors. Then even the landscape. So the background landscape is gold, but look at the mountains up towards the top of the scene. You have pink hills and green hills. These odd shapes that, again, are based on Chinese landscape elements. There are two issues here. One, we have seen that geometry, frames, boundaries are extremely important in the Islamic mentality, in the aesthetic. But what is so unique about many of these Safavid Persian manuscripts is that the image breaks out of the frame. Look at the left side. All of a sudden on the left, it breaks out. It overflows that frame. And that gives a sense of nature winning over human structures, over geometry, but it also gives the narrative a little more life. It's not so static. It's not so contained. Now, the figures seem to us to be very static. You don't have muscles and movement. You don't have three-dimensionality. But by bumping the image out of the frame, they thought it gave the image more life, more power. The example here is you see an old beggar woman who is approaching a man on a horse. Obviously, there's a man behind him holding an umbrella, so obviously the man in green is the protagonist, is the prince, the ruler in this case. So this is charity. So this old beggar woman comes to him and he bestows upon her charity. So it's a representation of virtue. Here we have an interesting scene, Muhammad ascending up to heaven. So there he is on the back of this mythical creature, and the angels are leading the way. So again, a lot of Chinese influence here, but it's a manuscript page, but it has so much wealth to it, very similar to many of the ceramics we saw, with that beautiful sense of luxuriousness. Now, the last painting I want to show is actually the most famous painting of all Persian paintings. It is called The Court of Gaimars. We actually know the name of the artist, Dost Mohammed, and this was painted between 1525 and 1535. It is a representation of a court. At the top, you see a seated man in a lotus position looking down upon another man to our right, and then a host of court people who are watching. You see another standing young male figure on the left of the composition. This is supposed to be a representation of the first king of Iran, and who ruled from a mountaintop. So they say that it is during his lifetime that men lived in cities, men learned how to domesticate animals, men learned how to grow their own food. But he is looking downward at that seated son. The seated son, he realizes, is going to be killed in battle. And the young man at the left of the painting is going to be the one, the young prince, who will, in the narrative, succeed his father and rule over Iran. So it is a narrative of history, of royal succession, with a tremendous amount of luxury. Now, again, it is bumping out of the frame that makes it so visually interesting, but also we see beautiful color for the sake of color, blues and purples and turquoise and whites and silvers and golds. And the whole composition, is it an empirical or a hyperbolic spiral? You have a circle within a circle. Everything is revolving around the center point. The king, his two sons, the courtiers are all revolving around him. And the last slide, here we see some details, your Chinese mountains, some beautiful details in the leaves and the branches of the trees. It's an inhabited vine, inhabited trees. You have lions and other creatures. So it represents the plentifulness of nature, the beauty of the world, the poetry of, the planet, and the sense of the great heroes and ancestors of these clans, tribes, empires, dynasties, nations. So that concludes our short discussion of Mongol and Safavid Persia. We have one left to go, which is Ottoman, and we'll also look at some other variants of Islam. Okay, thank you very much.